Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next in ClicData's series of webinars. Today, we're going to be speaking about APIs and how to use ClicData's Web Services Connector. I'm Rob Wood, Vice President of Sales for ClicData, and joining me today is Telmo Silver, Founder and CEO. First things first, we will be recording this webinar. We plan on having it be 30 minutes. We will try to stick to the schedule. Since we're recording it, the link will be sent out to everyone who registered it. If you have any questions, in the bottom right of your screen, you should see a chat box. Today's chat is moderated by Shri Neve, and we will try to answer any questions towards the end as well as we move along. So a few words about ClicData. We are the world's first 100% cloud-based BI solution. Founded in 2009, we have offices around the globe, including Canada, US, and France. We have strategic partners in Latin America, Australia, and Asia. And one of the great parts about ClicData is 94% of those that use our product would highly recommend us to a colleague or partner. ClicData views BI in 4 simple steps. You connect to any data at any source, anywhere, and that's kind of what we're going to be talking most about today. But then you pull that data into your data warehouse, which is provided in your ClicData subscription, where you're really able to leverage a set of very powerful tools to cleanse, blend, and prepare that data to then run that data through our data visualization warehouse, data visualization business intelligence engine. And then, of course, you can share your dashboards, your reports, your beautiful visualizations with whomever you like, whenever you'd like. So with that, I'll be turning it over to Telmo Silva.
All right, thanks, Rob. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. So as Rob mentioned, we're talking about APIs today. One of the critical steps here, obviously, of setting up your own data warehouse, your own BI platform, is the ability to connect to different data sources. At ClicData, we try to build native connectors. What we call native connectors is intelligence connectors that know what are they connecting to and how they can get to the data. But at the same time, there's hundreds and if not more systems out there that we do not have a connector for. But those systems, over time, they've built what's called APIs, or web services, to pull data from. And we're going to go through what exactly is an API and what are they used for, what are they good for. Also talk a little bit about standards and types of APIs. So I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's going to get a little bit technical. So we are talking about APIs, which is obviously something that is very, very technical and related to development and programmers. We're going to demonstrate some use of our API connector and how we are able to connect to different APIs. And again, we're going to talk a little bit about as well the future of APIs, specifically about OData and GraphQL technologies. So what is an API? An API is an application programming interface, and just by that name alone, you could, just turn around and start running, because it is code. It does involve technical, specifications and reading and understanding how those interfaces are built. But in a way, the way I like to think of APIs is kind of like the machine version of user interfaces, right? So when a software vendor back in the days would create their software, they would have an amazing user interface where people would enter data and pull data from, etc. But then when they wanted to automate that and kind of send bulk data to other systems or to your data warehouse, then they would build interfaces. Over time, they also wanted to extend the capabilities of their software so that other people could do things with that software. So APIs are not exclusively for data transfer, but they could also be used to develop extensions to a software. There are a lot of types of APIs. There are types that are more like software development kits. Some people call them APIs as well, because they are an interface, software SDKs. Libraries, They sometimes publish APIs, how to work with the library, frameworks, and web services. And each one of these can have different protocols and different authentication security and different content inside. The simplest of the APIs would be a URL where you would type your URL in the browser and you'd get a CSV data set. That would be your simplest of the APIs. You have no security. You just type the URL. There's a well-known protocol, the HTTP protocol. And basically the browser is your development platform. But obviously that is the most simplest one. As it relates to BI, we are talking about specifically data extraction APIs. So ClicData goes out to the different systems and extracts data from those systems, whatever systems they may be. But it's important to remember where this entire thing came from. And back in the days where, everybody was using, FTP as your main interface of data. You'd put a file of data on an FTP, and then you'd schedule an application to go every day and grab that FTP file and bring the data into your system, and you load it and so forth. Or you would ask for a direct access to the database. Or back in finance, EDIs, electronic document interface, which in essence are just different types of files being sent across other mechanisms. A lot of people developed interfaces with using email, and even before then, the good old mail. Just put a CD in the mail or a disk and ship it, and that's how data was transferred back in the day. FTP is still widely used, but APIs is definitely kind of the V2 of that, and that is the way things will move forward, is using this concept of using the internet as the medium to exchange data. So a typical API from a system to a system is there's a customer system that requests data, and there's some processing and saying, is this user allowed to see this data? What type of data am I sending it, preparing the data, and sending the response back. And then there's the mechanism by which, obviously, the medium, which is the internet. But then there's a series of protocols and agreements in terms of how the data is structured and which protocols to use. SOAP is a format of the message of that we send back. That among others, there's REST as well, and then there's things that even add more complexity, which is JSON and XML, which we'll get into in just a few seconds. But in essence, there's a request being made by a customer. Get me, that's the verb, get me some data. These are the parameters that I'm telling you. I would like you to give me a data where the effective status is active and paused. I want the field's name and objective. Here's my security. Here's an access token. And this is my account ID, which is the Facebook endpoint and for campaigns. So this entire structure, you can see it's very much a development programmer thing. You have to know all these little parameters and these little quirks in terms of how many quotes and double quotes and slashes and things like that. And this is using a program called curl. Our first API call, as I was mentioning before, is potentially the most simplest one of all. Is you grab a browser, you type this big URL, this is your endpoint, and you're going to get a result. Okay, so by the way, I'm going to try to do live demos as much as possible. The risk with live demos is obviously there's always a risk that things don't work, but I'm willing to take that gamble. So that's the first step. Is I just clicked on that link and it's not working. So it just went wrong. So there we go. Yes. Okay, there we go. So it just took a little while for PowerPoint to click on that link, but this is our API call. We passed all this stuff in there, okay? And we're gonna go through that in a little bit. And then it tells me all this stuff in here. That's the response. This is your first API call. So if we look here, we call the URL, which is the openweathermap.org. This is an open open data site that shows you the weather. There's a URL which is data 2.5 is the version most likely of this API. And then we pass a parameter saying, give me the weather, again, London, UK to be precise. And then there's an app ID, which is an identification to say, this is kind of my authentication for you to know that it's me calling that, please let me have that data. And, I've kind of structured that data here, but it tells you then the coordinates of London and the current weather, whether it's drizzle, etc., the temperature, the minimum temperature, the maximum, and a bunch of other stuff, sunrise, sunset, the whole thing. So this is your simplest of API calls. But as you can see, you need now to convert that entire thing that it sent you into something that looks halfway interesting information. You've asked for the temperature. Please show me that it's 5 degrees Celsius, not this entire thing. And you have to go through this entire thing to figure it out. And in here lies really the devil of the details of API, where everybody says, everybody has APIs, so it's easy to interchange information. But it really isn't. It's just now having to figure out the different standards, what standards are you using, and parsing it and converting it to raw data, and then finally displaying information. So somehow out of this structure, which by the way is called the JSON structured JavaScript notation, that you have to kind of parse it and say, okay, what am I looking for? Well, I'm actually looking for the main temperature, 278. And by the way, right off the bat, 278 is not either Fahrenheit or Celsius. And that's because this service gives you in Kelvin. So not only you have to do this, but you have to translate this into either Fahrenheit or Celsius. So, and that will lead into obviously the other features we have in ClicData, for example, which is data transformation and calculation and things like that. So this was just one simple example, and this is probably the simplest example we can find of calling an API and getting some data out. The weather, the temperature, right? The protocol and payload was very important there. Again, we talked about JSON. This is what JSON looks like. It's a structure using a lot of curly brackets and square brackets and quotes. But we also have XML as a standard. So this is the same thing you see in JSON in XML. And then you look in the good old CSV. It is quite simple, isn't it? I mean, back in the days where all you had to do is send in a CSV. So one would wonder why these days we use these complex notations and increase the payload substantially. We are adding a lot of bytes to this and slowing down transmission. But there's good reasons why we're using some of these versus that. But nonetheless, this is just a quick comparison of the three possible payloads, and they're not unique, by the way. There's others, but these are the most widely known, JSON being potentially the most widely known one, specifically as it stands for REST type of APIs. But even within, and again, I'm not trying to dismay you from trying to use APIs. Far from that, I do believe it is the future of data interfaces. But it is my role as well to kind of show you a little bit about the pitfalls and the complexity in all this, so that you better understand when you're having issues how to fix them as well. But even if you're using JSON and you think, oh, okay, everybody's using JSON. JSON is the way. Let me get on JSON, and my problems will be solved. I will always understand what JSON is. Well, that's not actually true, because even with JSON, there's different ways to do the same thing. So all these three examples here are the same. They contain the same data, but they have a different level of structure, a different level of detail that may or may not be used, and they're all equivalent in that sense. So in the first one, the square brackets is telling I'm going to send you 3 lines, and each line is represented by the curly brackets with the name and age. The second one actually calls that as an object, and JSON is all about object notation. That's what the O and the N stand for. So you should be naming all your objects. So just the same way you named the person named Eric, that's the name of the column, name, and the age is age. You should call that entire record something, person. And you should also be calling the whole collection people, so that when you look at this data, you say, okay, this is a list of people. And the first person that I have, this person, is this name and age, and so forth and so on. So again, when software developers implement APIs, depending on who's behind the design and the architecture of their API, they will pick and choose different standards. And so it makes our job and your job, if you're using APIs, a little bit harder. And we don't end there. There's other things that, unfortunately, is a problem. With CSVs back in the days, you'd send a file and you compress the file, and the file compressed could maybe take a few megabytes, maybe even 100 megabytes, but then you uncompress it and it's gigabytes of data, and you have your entire data set in one file. Well, if you experienced, loading large files across the internet is not ideal for sending large files. A lot of things happen during the internet. Network goes down, etc., and that causes the file to be corrupted, and you have to restart again. So web services and APIs are ideal for small batches, because the internet is made, the bandwidth is reduced, the payload size is reduced, so you can send a quick message very quickly, and then, again, send another page immediately after, and you send pages of data. And this method is called pagination, and most APIs have that. They have that because they don't want someone to take over their server and just sitting there downloading megabytes and hundreds of gigabytes of data. They serve a page at a time so that everybody gets a little bit of the time of the servers. So that is basically what pagination is. Now, I'm not going to get into security and authentication in detail, but again, I want you to tell you there's a lot of different ways that different solution providers, different software developers secure their access to the data. And we all heard about Facebook's issues in authorizing anybody to access their data banks through the APIs. But it's also about making sure that if you log in through an API, that you only get to see your data, and you have all the required scope of the data necessary to read the data that you're looking for. So there's different types of one. There's no authentication. We saw one when we grabbed the weather. One would say that this would be the authentication, but it really is just a little ID that you pass in. It's far from authentication. It's I guess the next best thing, if you will. Then there's basic, which is you pass a username and a password. Client credentials is kind of the same thing, but it's about automation. I'm not gonna get into all the different types. OAuth is very well known. OAuth, and a lot of you probably have seen this already. When you use one of the applications and it says, would you like to use Google login instead, or would you like to do Office 365 login instead? That is really deferring the security to somebody else. OAuth 2 is kind of the same thing. You will see that a lot of our connectors use OAuth 2, meaning we are not going to really validate and store your username and password on ClicData. We're going to redirect you, if you're trying to connect to Facebook, and let them ask you for your username and password. We would never ask you for that. And then all we get is we get a little response to saying, yes, this user is okay to get this data. So it is an attempt at keeping data secured and safe. Amazon has their own security, and there's many, many others. But I'm not going to get into all of this, but you have to be aware, and we're going to get into that in the documentation. Before I get into the final words, I just want to kind of summarize a little bit and then get into a couple of examples, and then I'll come back to the final words. Using an API can be quite a complex feat. And the complex in the protocol and the content, the pagination, all these things that we've talked about, throttling, which we didn't actually touch base on, but if you do have questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll definitely give you more information on other features of our web service connector. But by the same token, I think there's a couple programs out there, and one one of them is ours, this web connector that allows you to simplify things a little bit. But in that simplification, we have to understand that the connector is also very, very powerful and has a lot of options. Nonetheless, here's a couple of links that I'd like to go over with. I'm just going to minimize my presentation here for a second and bring my browser into view before we get into this. I'll maximize. The first one I'd like to bring your attention to is an open data directory. This is a GitHub, and the links will be posted after the webinar, where it lists all the systems out there, daily cat facts. That's a great one. That's I think in the grand scheme of things, this is probably the best API one would be able to connect. But you notice here, there's an auth column, there's HTTPS that shows you the protocol, and whether this allows, in this case, CORS means across domain reference, meaning can you access it from different domain URLs. But the important one is the auth. Do you need an authorization? In this case, luckily for us, CatFax allows us to get the API for CatFax, I guess, without even needing to get a key or an authorization. So there you go, guys. Let's all start getting facts about cats quickly. But no, seriously, about this GitHub is it's really a great source of all the systems, Gmail, Google Analytics, that have an API. And this is very interesting because, you know, we're seeing, and I don't think this is even half complete. I believe this is just the tip of the iceberg. One of the things that exists these days as well is open data. You probably have heard about open data. Open data is something that a lot of governments at the different levels, from municipalities, cities, all the way to state and federal and provincial, are doing. They are by law required to publish a lot of their, where they spend their funds, you know, all the way down to pollution and employment stats and census, etc. And there's a lot of open data sites out there. Again, different cities implement a different way, but again, there's a lot of good stuff there that you could potentially tap into. Now, to get into the examples, and again, you could have picked any of these examples. I picked one which is interesting, which is the Frankfurter app. And this one is about getting the exchange rates, okay? So this is a very simple API, a little bit more complex than the previous one that we saw about getting just the weather from London. This is about getting rates for, you know, for exchange rates for different currencies. And what I'd like to do is just go through the steps that I usually do, and a lot of our professional services team do, whenever we're being asked to assist one of our customers to say, hey, you know, I really want to connect to this application. You guys don't have a native connector, but I know they have an API. Can we connect using our web services connector, your API connector? And the first thing we do is we look at the documentation, and we start looking for different specific things. We start looking at, okay, is it a REST or SOAP connector? Do we need authentication? How do we, what is the syntax by which we can set it up to get the exchange rate? So this is the example I'm going to get started here on with my account, is exactly going through this to say, okay, well, let's see what we can do. So here's my account on ClicData here. I'm just going to go into one of folders here. Yeah, this one here. By the way, I did this just before, so I know it should work. But the internet these days being what it is, you never know, right? So we're going to start by adding a new connector. And here, I'm going to add a new connection. And I'm going to look for a web services connector. This is the big one here. You could have also searched here at the top. And the first thing it asks you for is obviously the name. I'm just going to type currency exchange. You can put your description. And the first thing he needs is kind of a host, a URL. And so this is where I go back to the documentation and start thinking, okay, what is the URL? Well, Here's the first thing about documentation. Documentation is, they tell you here get/latest, but that's not www anything. But I kind of think it's going to be this URL. Maybe it's in another documentation. Maybe they forgot to include it. I'm not sure why they would forget to include the single most important piece, which is what is your URL by which you call this API. But that's what it is. I'm going to paste it here. And a couple of things, I don't know if you saw, maybe it was too quick there, but when I pasted, and I pasted the full URL, ClicData automatically changed the protocol to HTTPS because he knows it's a secured, it's not HTTP. If you know a little bit about the difference between HTTP and HTTPS, the S stands, I'm sure, for something very complicated. In my mind, it stands for security. There's a certificate associated with it. And it changed the port to 443 automatically. So that's pretty good. My next tab here is asking for is authentication. So, here's some of the authentications that we support today. So again, I go back to my documentation and I start looking, okay, I don't see a section on authentication. Maybe there isn't any. And, sure enough, if you read deeply enough, you'll know that it does not require you to have an authentication. So you say, okay, well, that's fine. I'll leave it as none. And I'm just going to do a test connection. And it looks great, right? So I'm just going to next. So now I'm on the data set, and you notice the number of tabs we have, and a lot of the things we've discussed already, endpoints, paging, throttling, they're all here. So it's just to let you know, there's a lot of power behind this web service. But I'm just going to show you the basics here. The first thing I need to do is, well, obviously, if I need to correct the name again, I have another chance here, is the endpoint. So I know my base is, that's the URL that I'm going to. Notice here there's SOAP and REST, and there's different methods, get. So again, I go back to my documentation, and my documentation here tells me get is the verb and latest. Okay, so /latest will give me the latest rates, currency rates. So this is great. I'll go back to ClicData here, and I'm going to type /latest, and not knowing anything more, I'm just going to click preview here just to see if this gives me anything. So this is typically kind of one-on-one of discovery, trying to figure out what is this API about, is it working or not. And as you can see here, it does give me a lot of data. It tells me that for €1, in Australian dollars, this is 1.8. This is as of today, March 18th, etc. So different Canadian dollars, Swiss francs, etc. This is great, but not very useful because it's all bundled into one big column. And again, this is where our connector again kind of shines. And there's something called node. Now, again, you would notice that this has got the little curly brackets and so forth. Well, this is a JSON notation, and we are able to decipher that and to show you here, the different levels and so forth. And we can say, you know what, I'd like to get it at the rates level, and I want the parent fields as well in there as well. So now what does it look like? So I click preview, and you know that what it did is it kind of parsed everything. It put the currency code at the top in columns, etc., and then put each value in its own column. And this is great because then again, later we can unpivot this. This is kind of in a pivoted fashion. We can use a transform on this, and now we have the data in its raw format. And if we now automate this every day, we're start getting the currency exchange rates, which is great because you can do stock market, exchange rate charts. You can use this in other tables to convert, different invoices in different currencies into your native currency, etc. So this is just a simple example. Other example, I'm not going to get into it because this is running a little bit longer than I thought, is getting country data. Again, this was more to go into the open data discussion that or topic that I mentioned before. This is a website called datausa.io, which has a lot of different census information about, in this case, USA, but other nations as well, population, GOP, GDP, etc. Right? The last example here, and hopefully I'll be able to cover it fairly quickly because I know we are running a little bit beyond the promised 30 minutes, is the ability to actually connect to a real live system out there, Airtable. Above, before I get started, Airtable is an application that allows you to create databases and tables and put tables inside. And it's a great system. I'm going to show you a little bit my account here. If you guys can see my screen, you'll see that this is my Airtable account. And, in here I have project tracking, digital content calendar, all kinds of different things here. And also I've imported an Excel into it, which automatically converted into an Airtable. And if you look at my data here, you have a bunch of rows of data, columns, much like an Excel spreadsheet or a database, right? So this is a great cloud application. We love it, but we do not have a native connector for it yet. So again, we're going to go through the steps of connecting to Airtable. And if we remember the steps before, the first step is always read the documentation. And Airtable's got a very unique API in which you can actually get started right away. You need an API key, and then you need an ID, and this is the ID that you get. The API key, you get it on your account. I'm not going to show that to you guys, but you get. I'm just going to open up the properties of my Airtable data. There's an endpoint. The endpoint is API airtable.com. That's fairly straightforward. Much like the weather and the other ones, is a REST GET. And then there's a bunch of stuff here. Now, you notice here, this is my key. I had to put my key, which again is what they provided on this screen here on the documentation. I have to put that in there to get the data, okay? And if I do that, and here's the full thing here. If I do that, I should be able to get my data. So again, going back to ClicData, I pasted all that. The authentication is there. I passed it in the connection as the authentication. And now I should be able to hopefully connect to Airtable and bring my data across directly as it's shown there. We give a little bit of a preview here, but you can then just load this up and so forth. And there's obviously this is a great tool because, again, you don't need to wait for us to build a native connector for this. You can use our web services for hundreds, if not thousands of applications these days, and it really allows you to get your data with all, even if those APIs are not totally standard. We have a lot of different options to go through. And again, for more information, I urge you to go to our help system, help.clicdata.com, to know more about our web services connector and how you can connect your needed data source into ClicData. And I'm just going to go back to the presentation here. And again, I'm sorry I'm running late, but this is obviously something that I'm quite passionate about, as hopefully you can tell. But my final words, and I'd love to get more into the future of it, but is really the web service is an efficient way of getting data. We just need the internet. It does take a little bit of understanding, and sometimes some of the implementations of those APIs are a little bit hard, especially if they lack standards, if there is such a thing. But there is a light here. OData was a first attempt back in 2007. That's over 13 years ago. Microsoft started this in the hopes that we can standardize how we use APIs. Few applications adopted it, so it didn't. Microsoft was not cool back then, because Facebook was cool in 2015, and they released something called GraphQL, which is admittedly a more interesting implementation a flexible API system, but definitely a lot more complex than OData. Everybody adopted, or not everybody, but quite a few companies are adopting GraphQL, including ourselves. We are adopting GraphQL as a standard to get data out of ClicData, not into ClicData, but out of ClicData. But we will also have a GraphQL connector to bring data from a GraphQL compatible. So GraphQL looks to be a great way to simplify all these things, but it will not solve all the problems, such as the authentication and the paging, the security and the paging is still things, and the throttling as well, or the volume of data that you ask for, that APIs will be able to offer. But it does fix other things, which is the syntax of JSON, and the different ways of parsing XML or JSON, etc. So we're looking forward to seeing how GraphQL is going to be used in the years to come. With that, I'm going to shift it over back to Rob, and wishing everybody a safe and healthy time.
Thanks, Tomo. We definitely learned a little bit more than we probably thought we were going to, but this is awesome. We really appreciate your time. One of the things I do want to point out is, as Tomo did mention, we do have native connectors for over 50 applications. We keep the web services and the API strong because our motto is, it's your data, connect to it any place, any source. Sri Neve, who will be providing some answers to some questions, he runs our professional services group. Him and his team are always happy to help you walk through, help you get things set up. We're here to make sure that you're successful. Sri, do we have any questions that we want to address here this morning?
Yeah, we do have a few questions. So the first question what we have is regarding native applications that don't have an API. If anyone wants to connect to those applications which don't have an API, what are the different options that ClicData provides?
That's a good point. We actually have quite a few options. Obviously, the first option is if it's an application that has a database, we have a lot of database connectors, ODBC for all the connectors that we don't have. One thing that we do have as well is data by email. Now, data by email is quite an interesting option here. And I'm just going to quickly show it on my screen. I'm still sharing, so that's all good. It's a very simple option. If your system is able to, on a regular basis, export by email and send you an attached file with an Excel or a CSV, we have a data by email. So you just instead tell the system to send a data loader at ClicData.com and make sure it attaches the file. There's some security things that you can put here if needed. And whenever ClicData receives this email, it knows it's for your account. It unzips it. If it comes zipped, it then inserts the data into your account as if it was a little bit of an automated interface. So that's another way to do it, right? And then of course you have the quite a bit of like Google Sheets and Dropbox and what Microsoft calls a Drive, OneDrive, etc. I mean, all those, you can put your data there or ask your partners or employees or managers to place the data there, and then ClicData just goes in and gets the data on a regular basis as well. So those are just some of the ways we can get data if you don't have API.
Awesome. Thank you, Thelmo. And just to add to what Thelmo mentioned, if you're also trying to connect to a local application, we also support ODBC. So most of the local applications have an ODBC driver, and that's another great way to connect to applications that don't have an API. The next question we have is there any limit in the number of applications that the users can connect to using the web service connector on ClicData?
Absolutely not. No, we have hundreds of connectors. I mean, just my simple account here, we have a lot. Each one of these is one type of connector, and each one of these, for example, here, I have 9 different connections to Dropbox and so forth. We do not place limits on the number of connections, only on the total volume of data that you have across your entire, all your data sets.
Thank you, Thelmo. I do have a lot of questions. We are going to go and answer those questions personally. We're going to reach out to you and send emails for the people we could not answer. I'm going to take on a last question. So the last question, Thelma, for you is, ClicData also provides an API. Could you talk a little bit about the use cases on where customers can use ClicData's API?
Absolutely. There's a couple of cases where using our API, and this gets confusing sometimes because we were talking about APIs, but we're talking about APIs that ClicData goes to get data for you. Whereas in this case, it's an API where once you have data inside ClicData, maybe you want to share with another system. So it's kind of the reverse. It's the export way of doing things. But our API actually allows you to also put data in. This is where things can sometimes getting a little bit confusing, but the use cases, the number one use case to me, based on me working with some clients, is the ability to have real-time data. As you know, potentially with ClicData, you can schedule, there's a scheduler, and you can refresh data every minute. So again, going back to our Airtable example, if my data on Airtable was being updated every few seconds by different people, you could set up a schedule here every minute to go in and get the data. But let's say that your use case is you want to know it immediately. Well, with a little bit of coding, you can actually call our API. And I'm going to give you the endpoint here. You see there's gets and posts, exactly like all the other ones, where you can actually put data in immediately. So real-time data with our API is definitely something that you can do. The other use case of using our API is to build your own application. So for example, maybe you don't like our mobile application, or maybe you don't want your users to use our browser application, the one you have here, and you want to build your own. There's a lot of things you can do here with this API to list your dashboards, to get the thumbnails so that you click on them or touch on them on a mobile and it opens up the dashboard, to see your data, to refresh and automate your schedules. You can do that, to add, insert, manage your users and teams. So our API almost replaces it. If you guys remember what I said at the beginning, that an API is really a programmer's way or a computer way to that replaces the user interface. It's the interface for the program. Well, that's exactly it. This is, you can build your own application using our API or automation using our API. So it's really the developer's way. So those two cases are the most widely used ones. Obviously, if you use ClicData as an extraction tool only, but then you want to export that out to something else, you can also use our API to get data out of ClicData if you don't want to use our export facility, and use our API to get data out. So again, those are 2 or 3 cases that our API is good for.
All right. I believe that was our last question. With that, everybody, we appreciate your time today. We appreciate the fact that, Thelma, we were able to join us. Shri, thank you very much. And everyone, stay safe and have a wonderful rest of your day.